main themes that I heard at the retreat that sort of touched me was the difference between fantasy and reality, and that fantasy pretty much is everything that we can identify as something. So it's been interesting since I'm back to actually observe that and to see that I've always thought of fantasy as something that's non-tangible and therefore is nothing.
Right.
But I actually see that it is very clearly something, because it exists as a kind of idea or a thought or an image or an emotional response or something that I think is something.
Yeah.
So sort of getting that has been really interesting.
That's very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, the main problem in confusion is confusing actuality with fantasy, of course. So, giving that some attention and discovering, being able to differentiate that is very useful, very powerful.
And in some way, it's kind of the opposite of what I think it is.
Well, it is. It is, because what we think is concrete is a fantasy, because what is actually concrete cannot be thought.
Right. And so I notice that when I'm not sure of what something is, that's clearly reality.
Exactly so. And if you notice carefully, you'll notice you can't really be sure what anything is.
Uh-huh.
And so then you discover that essentially fantasy doesn't actually exist at all.
Right.
Even though the apparent overlay of fantasy seems to cover everything, it doesn't actually cover anything.
Well, maybe that's one of the things I've been seeing, is that when I notice something is something and then I look more deeply, I realize that in fact it isn't anything.
Yes, yes.
And then I'm left with, oh, well, this is interesting,
Yeah.
because being in this unidentifiable state is actually a good thing, as opposed
It's a very
to
good thing.
what we're taught to think, which is that being in an unidentifiable state is, the doorway to hell.
Well, the human, the whole human identification mechanism is predicated upon the sort of philosophical underlying that you're supposed to know who you are, you're supposed to know what's going on, you're supposed to be able to come up, spit out all this stuff, and that is a good thing, and anything other than that is not a not good thing. And of course, that's entirely asked backwards. All of these identifyings of what things are and what conditions consist of, and worst of all, what we are, is the problem, not a solution. And it actually causes all problems, causes all suffering, causes all confusion. So it's the basis for insecurity. And of course, the commonplace, human frame of reference is that we actually get some kind of security by all this defining, that we're actually gaining something reliable and something secure and something that's going to be a safety net or something. And in actuality, we're creating all of our problems. Actual safety lies in reality, which is completely not specifiable. And yet it is the basis for genuine security, genuine support, genuine nourishment, all these kinds of aspects.
I think the other thing that I noticed a lot on the weekend was that, this thing about that everything is fantasy. Like there's not one fantasy that's worse than another or better than another, but it's kind of across the board.
Yeah, all fantasy is equal, and it's equal in being absolutely pointless except as a distraction. At worst it's a distraction, at best it's an entertainment.
Yeah.
So if you go to a movie and you know it's a movie, then that's using fantasy for entertainment, and it's not entrapping, necessarily. But if you interpret things and hold them to actually be that, then it's potentially very entrapping.
Yeah.
I mean, not literally, not actually. There's nothing to be entrapped and there's nothing to be trapped in.
Right.
But nonetheless, it can be so confusing as to be effectively entrapping.
Well, and even the amount of energy that I put into not being trapped is, just the same thing too. That I put into not wanting to pay attention to what it is that's going on that is not real. If that makes any sense.
I don't follow you.
Well, it's a kind of a spiritual conundrum. That we have this idea that something is good and something isn't good,
right?
And then we put a lot of energy into looking for the good, as opposed or denying the not good.
Right.
When in actual fact, they're neither of them are any different.
Right.
It's all the same thing in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Peter, in actuality, isn't it the interpretation that is not real rather than a fantasy?
Yes. Well, at the retreat we went on this at great length, and it's of course fantasy per se is not the problem. It's confusing fantasy with actuality. In other words, interpreting a fantasy as being objectively true, or defining objective conditions that are true. But which of course is that. But yeah, I mean, calling it fantasy is just a shortcut of that whole mechanism. Yeah, fantasy is great. Fantasy is one of the major modes of reality. It's wonderful. Yeah, fantasy is wonderful. If we wanted to have a one-word catch-all for that problematic turning point, is probably belief is better than fantasy, because it's belief in the fantasies as being actual that's the problem, not fantasy per se. what I've called noticing is essentially playing with that mechanism, playing with the fact that experience can be directly experienced outside of a context of belief, outside of a context of holding any notions you have about it, i.e. fantasies, to be actual. And so, but again, it's all just addressing this one. I mean, this is the razor's edge that really defines the whole spiritual conundrum right there. It's belief. Mm-hmm. Discovering that reality is completely unbelievable. You can't believe anything about it accurately. And as soon as you are believing something about it or holding anything about it to be a certain way, which turns out to be belief, that's where the problems arise. Mm-hmm. If there seem to be any apparent problem.
I was looking at that word problem and wondered what you mean by problem. Well,
problem is meaningless, but if you mean anything by problem, then that's a problem. If the word problem has any meaning in your existence whatsoever, then that's a symptom of that you have problems.
No, I was just wondering what you meant by that.
A problem is the belief that there are problems. A problem is belief that there are some conditions, or let's just say loosely, some conditions that are having a problematic impact on some other conditions that it would be an improvement to remedy.
Still using the same word.
Which?
Problematic or problem. It just means that you think that something should be different than what it is, or that.
Well, you think something is any way at all, and as soon as you think it's a way, then it may or may not be. Should be different. But even if it shouldn't be different, there's an it there is the root issue. There's no it. There is no identifiable conditions.
You're assessing a situation as being.
Well, you're assessing a situation as being a situation in the first place, and then secondarily, you may be giving it a value judgment and reacting to that value judgment. But there's a couple layers there. The initial problem is that there's a situation. So. The real challenge is holding anything to be anything.
Well, like a flat tire.
What about it?
It's a situation.
No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not a situation.
It's something that has to be assessed.
No, it's not.
Deal with it.
No, it's not. It's an infinite, apparent virtual patterning of call it transcendental experiencing, and any subsequent apparent other conditions that are associated with that, like addressing it and figuring out what to do about it and all that, are more presence of transcendental experiencing, which doesn't self. It's like a dream. You get a flat tire in a dream, it's a big problem. So you know it's just a dream, and then there's no flat tire, there's no problem. And even if there's a problem, there's no problem if there's a problem, because it's not actually a problem, it's just a fucking dream. Forgive the language. I get excited.
Favorite type of dream.
So how do you deal with the flat tire?
Any way you do.
In a non-dualistic way.
Any way that you do. Any way you deal with it is not dualistic, because there's no such thing as dualism. Maybe you get out of your car and look for the jack. Maybe you find the jack or not. If you find the jack, maybe you try and change it yourself. If you try and change it yourself, maybe you succeed or not. If you succeed, then fine. If you don't succeed, maybe you flag someone down. Maybe you phone AAA. Maybe AAA doesn't answer the phone. So maybe you just sort of freak out and abandon the whole thing and walk off to a motel or a bar. Who knows? But all of that, but every step of that is a non-event that does itself as a transcendental energy called energy display. Or maybe you don't do that. Maybe you do something entirely different. In other words, the complexity of the narrative tree of the steps that you might theoretically take in a situation very rapidly becomes infinite. And every step of the way is not what is being described as, and every step of the way is nothing whatsoever other than, call it transcendental energy presence experiencing itself, doing itself. It does itself. Flat tires do themselves, repairing it do itself, does itself, not repairing it does itself. Getting pissed off and lighting your car on fire does itself. Whatever, right? I mean, it's real life. Except for the life part. Except for the life part. It's not that things don't happen, it's just that there's no things.
What about the happen part?
Well, there's no happen either, but you don't need to worry about that so much. If there's no things, then whether or not there's a happen, it sort of becomes less and less relevant.
So problems are a belief and beliefs are problems.
Yeah, absolutely. If there seems to be a problem, it's belief. If there seems to be a belief, there's a problem.
Peter, there's a question here from the
Uh-huh.
internet. Do you carry any projections, any fears, any judgments, any desire, any demands, any requirements of yourself?
That's a big list. Would you give me those one at a time, please?
All right, well, you talk about fears or judgments.
No fears. Judgment is a slippery notion. I have biases. I have preferences. Whether or not those are judgments, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. And then desires or demands or requirements.
Lots of desires. Oh, of myself.
Any desire, any demands, any requirements of yourself.
I wouldn't qualify it myself. I just do whatever I want. But you might qualify that as demands, desires, and requirements. But that's way too complex. It's just a simple. It's a simple. See food, eat food. Want to leave. Don't want to leave, don't leave. So whether that's a requirement or a demand may be complexifying it a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a curious question because, I mean, we've talked about these kind of things. We just keep what we have them, but they just don't matter. I mean, they don't matter.
Because they aren't anything.
They're nothing.
They are them. They are transcendental radiance.
Right.
So anything whatsoever that you want to designate, a psychological condition, a physical condition, an action condition, wild speculation, whatsoever, is all just transcendental radiance. So there's nothing to differentiate. There's absolutely, even delusion is transcendental radiance. Delusion is not a problem. It's not a problem at all. But coming to see that it's not a problem may be a solution if it seems to be a problem. So it's a little bit like elephant repellent.
Elephant what?
Repellent.
It always works.
There's no elephants around. It must be
But if
working.
you believe in them, then you're not transcending. Right.
Which?
Well,
If there's any belief, it's not actually a problem. But if there's belief and it seems to be a problem, then there's a solution. And the solution is to discover that it's not actually a problem. Which doesn't stop belief, but it reveals that belief isn't actually belief, which solves the problem.
right. Got that.
It's all a matter of misinterpretation. It's not a matter of changing event. And if misinterpretation seems to be a problem, misinterpretation is not a problem intrinsically. But if it seems to be a problem, that seeming problem has a seeming solution.
There's sort of calculus. There's sort of calculus to this. I mean,
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a yoga. It's a trick. It's practical. It's practical.
Exactly.
You know, it's pragmatic. If there seems to be a problem, there seems to be a solution, and you can avail yourself to it. But in actuality, there's no problems and no solutions, and ignorance is not bad, and clear understanding or clear seeing is not good. Nothing is gained by clear seeing, and nothing is lost by ignorance. Ignorance is one of reality's major modes. It has just oodles of fun doing that.
So the yoga is just sort of a trick or a way to transcend. I mean,
Well, just if there seems, the clearest way I can put it is if there seems to be a problem, yoga is the solution to all problems, any and all problems.
Yeah.
It cuts the root of the even potential existence of any problematic condition whatsoever in the entirety of being.
But isn't there desire in the pursuit of the yoga?
Sure, but what's wrong with desire?
So the desire, it just is.
Of course, everything just is. Desire is not bad. Desire is nothing. Desire is not desire. There's nothing bad, nothing good. There's no preferred condition. There's no preferred state. There's no energy which is in any way superior or inferior to any other energy. Hate is not better or worse than love. Desire is not better or worse than indifference. Or what happened, fill in the blank is not better or worse than fill in the blank. And you can use wild abandon filling in those blanks. Because anything you would fill in the blank with doesn't actually exist as such. What you're really saying is radiance is not better or worse than radiance, because any word you come up with is just a designation for radiance. And if you think the word actually applies, it's a misunderstanding of radiance. But you're supposing radiance is actually the thing you're thinking it is, instead of seeing that it's what it actually is, which is infinity. Infinite radiance. Nothing has an end, nothing has a limit, a beginning, nothing has a center, nothing has a definable nature. Everything has a parent, let's say a parent gestalt of experiential flavors it presents in, which can be enormously complex. But if you go looking for this apparent gestalt, you don't actually find it. It's more an implication that is completely baseless, and you don't actually find, you can't resolve it into anything.
Feel like right there is the where belief is.
Yeah, exactly. It's holding that a superficial perspective on any apparent condition is accurate.
Well, it's believing that it's having the implication become more than an implication. I mean, everything implies everything.
Yeah.
But
Sure.
that's all it's going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you try and parse it out, then of course then there's nothing.
Yeah.
But
Again and again and again, the very, very simplest analogy. Here we go again. The very, very simplest metaphor, parable for all this stuff is the dream. It's so easy to look at a dream from the waking perspective, and all of a sudden you understand exactly how everything works. A dream looks as if it's this and that. It looks as if it's people. It looks as if it's places. It looks as if it's things. It looks as if it's event. It looks as if flat tires are flat tires and trees are trees and money is money and goblins are goblins. But there's nothing there. The only thing that's there is dream, and you can't find what dream is, so there's essentially nothing there, but without being nothing. There's nothing findable there. There's no definition there. And that is exactly the condition that exists right here. There's all of this appearance that is pregnant with seeming to be all of this amazing, conditions and so on and so forth, and yet in actuality nothing's here. Any more than anything is there in the dream. It looks as if there may be all sorts of something there in the dream, but the operative word is looks and maybe. And when you get that all the interpretation we do in the waking state is also hypothetical. Yeah, you may be a person, this may be a room, this may be a floor. That's fine. There's no entrapment there. But if you are a person, this is a floor, this is a room, I'm screwed. All of a sudden I'm living in a material universe, and what do you do about that?
Yeah.
I mean, the shit hits the fan.
Well, we know a dream from another state,
Exactly.
but there doesn't seem to be any other state.
Yeah, there is. This is another state in itself. In the same sense that the other state from a dream, going lucid in a dream, is the other state within the dream. You don't need to leave the dream to see that it's a dream. And you don't need to leave this condition to see that it is this condition. And yet we do leave this condition all the time. When you go to sleep, where does this world go? Or when time passes, where does this world go? Where's yesterday? Where is it? Where's the conditions of yesterday?
Here. Not there.
Conditions of yesterday can't. I mean, the point is that this doesn't stand up to very close scrutiny. It really doesn't. And the only way that it seems to stand up is we don't do the close scrutiny, because we've already paid the piper and bought into a belief system, and then you just stop looking. It's just, what do you mean this isn't the material universe? Look around, you asshole. This is the material universe. But by saying that, you're declaring, I'm not looking. I'm not going to look. It is a material universe. I'm not looking. I'm taking it on faith. My faith. I'm keeping the faith, baby. And that refusal to look is closing the door on potential liberation. Because looking, which is really quite easy to do, I think.
So you say.
So says you.
Looking is very easy, but it's much easier to rely on faith.
Of course. Sure.
Because it's harder.
You just go with what everyone around you seems to be saying. Go with the words. Go with the description.
Jesus told me.
That's right. The Bible says so. The Bible said so. The newspaper says so. The government says so. Wikipedia says so.
In the end and in reality, that's actually much more work and much more energy expenditure and
Sure
much
is.
harder.
Yeah, it is. But
Just
you
have to
don't.
look
But you
once
don't
and
know
know
that that's the case until you see that that's the case.
Just have to look once.
Yeah, delusion is a hell of a lot of work. It's a pain in the ass. And
It's not easy at all. It's like a juggling act.
yeah, it's exhausting.
Contradictions.
It's exhausting. I mean, that's why people are generally, by and large, so escapist.
Yeah.
Because it's, oh God, thank God it's Friday.
Now I get to work at my house all day.
Yeah, right.
Gotta say, nice nails.
Oh, thanks. These are my spiritual nails.
Energy vortices.
That's right. Vortices.
So belief seems to be a kind of, when I kind of feel it, it's like a kind of inner movement of some sort, or almost like a rut or a pathway or something. And it has this quality of turning away, of turning away. But why is it that we're, at different points, why we're averse to noticing or just being with reality?
There's no way to say. I mean, because you can't, of course, like all actuality, you can't say what belief is. You can't find belief, you can't pin it down, you can't analyze it. And you can't analyze it, why and how it is what it is, because you can't actually find any of those elements either. So the whole thing, reveals its transcendentality. It's all it gets down to empirical. You can't pin anything down in terms of figuring out what it is or why it is the way it is or how it is the way it is. So all you can really do is deal with it to the extent that seems doable, if it seems appropriate to try. You can't say how to do noticing. You can't say why there's an aversion, a resistance to noticing. You can't say why suddenly it becomes there becomes more and more of a motivation to do noticing. You can't say how to do noticing, and you can't say why noticing is effective, and you can't say what happens when noticing is effective and you have realization and see what this is. Every step of that chain, so to speak, can't be found, can't be defined, can't be pinned down. So you can indicate it, you can work with it to the extent it seems appropriate to work with it, if any. But the entire thing is just a mystery. Because you can't say what anything is. Anything.
Well, doesn't that leave you in kind of a pickle? How do you distinguish then between fantasy and reality?
You don't need to. That's the point. But you can discover that you don't need to. Once you know you don't need to distinguish between fantasy and reality, you no longer need to be careful about indulging in belief. Because belief is just radiant. Belief is only a problem if it's a problem. And it's only a problem if you think that it's belief, that you think that it's true. When you see that belief is radiance, when you really get 100% that belief is radiance, all of a sudden, how can it be a problem? How can radiance be a problem? Radiance is a solution, not a problem. Radiance is revelation. Radiance is divine transcendence. Radiance is hallelujah, hallelujah, free at last. Yeah, so if belief is that, then have at it. But if belief isn't that, there's yoga. And then you discover that belief is that, and then you've solved the non-existent problem by discovering that it was non-existent. And of course, since it's non-existent at that point, you no longer need to worry about it. Belief is not intrinsically bad. It's not even intrinsically a problem. It's just another, Maha city of this Maha weirdness that obtains.
My friend was saying that she's really good at making up lies and getting people to believe them.
Me too.
Because she's and so she was, and I was saying, I'm not a very good liar. I can't just say I met Joe DiMaggio and that was great. But so she was trying to get me to tell a lie and just be straight faced about it. But I didn't have the heart to say I'm a human being. This is the world, like this is planet Earth, and
That's a good
so
lie.
I know that's so. But then I'm like, oh, I'm thinking I'm really good at telling lies, like
That's right.
But it was just like I was sitting there laughing at her because she was saying, tell a lie, and I'm like, oh, God, what? Where do I start?
As soon as you open your mouth, it's all lies.
That's what I was going to say. I've been doing nothing but lying.
Right.
As soon as someone asks you something and you answer, you're lying.
That's right.
How you doing today? Oh, I'm great.
Or this is
What's that even mean?
How did you sleep last night? Like, how do you even? All these weird systems, and it's so silly.
Yeah, it's silly. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's just really so silly. None of these notions actually apply. Lying and non-lying don't actually apply. They're not relevant. But nothing you can say is ultimately or actually relevant. Nothing you can qualify as being this or that is actually applies. It's relevant. It's not. It's a D none of the above situation. That category does not apply to this. And so any category whatsoever you come up with, no, I'm sorry, that doesn't apply to this.
Peter, there's a couple of good questions here about
Oh, good.
prayer.
All right.
I find that since I've been investigating reality in this way, I've had difficulty praying, and I don't understand the act anymore. And then someone says, well, yeah, it's sort of an interesting question. I'd love to hear Peter's thoughts about prayer. Who would we be actually praying to and why?
Well, the whole question hinges on exactly, precisely what do you mean by prayer? If prayer is you asking some other being or transcendental being or anything for something, or talking to such a being, or whatever. That's just one arbitrary possible definition, and there's no doubt infinite possible definitions. But whatever that definition is, you have if you look at if the elements of that definition actually exist, it starts to get a little fuzzy. So if I'm talking to God, what exactly do I mean by I? What exactly do I mean by God? What exactly do I mean by talking? And it all, the simplistic structure of a me and a God and some kind of communion, or talking or asking or whatever, emoting or anything, becomes overly simplistic, and it sort of self-destructs when you look at it. It's not that prayer is nothing. Of course it is something. It is radiance. But that's all it is. But that's all anything is. So it's not actually an issue. Prayer. As people get typically more in a more non-dual mode to speak horrible doggerel. They may think of their prayer as being more meditation, or communion with being, or noticing is prayer. But what is noticing? Well, you can't say what noticing is, which is why it's powerful, because there's no structure there. When there's a structure of like implicit in there's a me and there's a God and there's some kind of a exchange, that structure is too heavy-handed. It doesn't hold up. So prayer in itself is a great vehicle for noticing. If you are a prayer, then do the praying and look at what it is. Look at what happens when the praying happens, and you will ultimately discover radiance, because there's nothing else to discover.
Yeah,
Radiance is what there is.
I've done various forms of prayer.
Sure.
And
everyone has.
But it was, it is sort of like noticing. Or it's like questioning. Here, in that I'm really asking what I know inside myself.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe.
In the same way with prayer, that the
Maybe
answers coming.
Yeah.
Sure. from
Yeah.
it's transcend, the transcendent.
Yeah,
Right?
but even that, when you look at that, and when you're really with that, it's like, the question, the answer, the coming from,
Oh,
and
that
it all.
is crazy.
Well,
That is way-
because the point is basically it all opens up into radiance.
yeah.
So whatever it seems to be, the trick is always you do noticing. Be with it. Be with what is actually present, outside of a context of pre-expectation or a definitional frame of reference, and you will discover radiance, pure and simple, because that's what there is. You can't find anything else because there ain't nothing else to find. You can't even find that, so but don't worry about that. The ultimate red herring. The myth of radiance.
It's a very interesting topic. I remember. This is an interesting topic. I remember at some point deciding that I don't need to pray anymore. Like, this is great, because I kind of looked at it as having a communing with the divine, or communicating with God or whatever.
Sure.
And then when I realized that walking down the street is prayer, and
Yeah.
sneezing is prayer, and
Yeah.
taking a shower is prayer, then it's like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
this is fine. I don't have to say anything.
It's radiance. It's all the infinite transcendentality being with itself.
Yeah.
I mean, that's as prayer as it gets,
Yeah.
and that's what we got.
You're swimming in it, right?
Yes, as soon as anything shows up, that's that. I mean,
Yeah.
done deal. Check that off the list. Done my prayers for the day.
Seems like prayer, the word prayer and radiance, is like just a contradiction.
Well, they would be if they meant what they said, but of course they don't. The trick is that what words mean is actually what they refer to, not their dictionary meaning. And if you go looking at the actuality that prayer consists of, you find radiance. So prayer is actually just a word for radiance. But of course, that's no surprise because every word's a word for radiance.
But sometimes I think when you pray and you go inside, before you get to that meditative sort of place, you go inside and sort of having a talk with yourself or some sort of communion with yourself.
Sure.
It seems to me you're labeling.
Of course you are. That's the point.
But then that is not radiance.
Of course it is. Labeling is radiance.
Everything's radiant.
What
When
else?
you're labeling
What?
it,
Of course. How could it not be radiance? What would it be made of? What's labeling made of? Here, I'm labeling now. I'm going to call this a hassock. So there's labeling. So what just happened when I called this a hassock?
well, I guess then when you're labeling and waiting for, I guess it's the response portion of it, it seems.
Sure. But even if a response seems to show up, the response is radiance too.
I think what you're saying then is that when you're doing this praying and you're believing in it, you're not seeing that it is radiance.
Yeah, you may not be seeing that it's radiance, but and that applies to anything you're defining as being something.
the not seeing is radiance.
Yeah, but not yet. In actual fact, not seeing is radiance. Ultimately, it is nothing other than radiance. So it gets very kind of paradoxical when you try and make sense of it. But when you approach things in terms of a relatively normal worldview of our common descriptions of things, the descriptions are entirely inaccurate. And so, number one is to notice that fact. And once you notice that fact, a lot of questions are answered just right there, because then you get that, just because prayer is defined as being XYZ doesn't make it so. So then all of a sudden the way is clear to say, well, if it's not XYZ, then what is it? And what is it? All of a sudden opens the door for noticing. All of a sudden opens the door for, well, what is here? And what is the answer to the question, what is here, is always the same answer, ultimately. And that happens within any context of investigation whatsoever. You look at prayer, and, well, what is actually here in prayer, and you're going to find radiance. Getting angry at somebody, but what is actually here is getting angry at somebody. You're going to find radiance. Anything whatsoever. A discussion like this, what's actually here, you're going to find radiance because there's nothing else to find. And the bizarre, miraculous aspect of radiance is it can look like anything. It can look like absolutely anything, but it's just itself. Just like a dream can look like anything, but it's just dream. It never goes beyond dream. It never becomes more than dream. It never becomes less than dream. But it can look like absolutely anything. Absolutely anything. And this is just like that. It can look like anything, but it never departs from itself. It's always just this. I made up this word radiance, this notion of radiance, because it's not without certain value and evocative property and all. But what this is itself. It's not actually radiance. It doesn't conform to any notion, obviously.
Jillian was talking about how she had pain in dreams, and I wasn't able to really relate to that. But then I was lucid in a dream, and I thought I'd try it out, and there's this little bug, and I put my finger next to it. It bit me with its teeth and its claws, and it hurt a lot. And then I I knew it was a dream, but it just totally hurt. But I put it down, and it got off. But then I just thought the relationship between lucidity and control is weird because it's like because I saw a bug, but what it got on my finger like I wanted it to. Other times things don't do what I want them to do at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's very strange. And I guess the feeling of control is another just aspect of radiance.
Exactly. Yeah, the feeling of control. This infinite spectrum from absolute control to no control and all these infinite gradations in between are completely weird.
Yeah.
And again, of course, naturally, no surprise, it doesn't actually resolve into some simple condition of this or that.
And calling it control is a misnomer.
Yeah.
Calling it no control is also a misnomer.
Of course, it's just that category those categories don't actually apply.
It's irrelevant.
And of course we find that in this waking condition. Is there control? Well, sure. Is there no control? Well, sure.
Right.
And it's just but it's just not. It's just that's just too way simple a range of categories to look at this in terms of.
Yeah, the mind that most people want to come down on one side or the other.
Yeah, sure.
But it contradicts itself if you look at it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Ultimately, yeah. If you look at it, everything just falls apart under its own oversimplicity.
Yeah.
Everything is unendingly fluid and weird and paradoxical and self-contradictory. And it's really obvious to see that with just even a little looking.
Yeah. Doing simple things like the fact that people, they don't want anyone to die, but they also want babies, and not overpopulation. But it's like fundamental things that everyone believes don't make any sense at all.
Oh no, no sense. Not a relevant sense is definitely not a relevant category. That may be one of the least relevant categories. If there was such a thing. I mean, it's not really relevant to anything, but in the whole notion of pain in dream, anything whatsoever that is experienceable in dream. Anything that's experienceable in waking state is experienceable in dream.
Yeah.
And I know from the way you say, you have a lot of experience of lucidity, and so you must be quite aware that a dream is just like this.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, exactly. Not like similar, but exactly.
Yeah.
The level of detail and realism, let's say, and apparent consistency that can present in a dream is staggering.
Yeah.
No less than this.
Yeah. It has if you look at stuff, it's like as detailed as this.
Totally.
Things can feel completely solid, like it feels like sitting in this chair.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, the list goes on and on.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
It's just another aspect of this. It just continues
Yeah.
in that way. So
Well, it's the same condition. It's
yeah.
it's just another mode of presentation, all of which are ultimately inconsistent. I mean, deep sleep is the same as dream and the same as this.
Yeah.
It just presents it with a sort of different range of dominant characteristics, but not even actually.
Yeah.
They're not actually a different range.
There's a bias which you've mentioned to think of waking as real and dreaming as unreal.
Of course, yeah.
Which I'm even exploring it a lot. I subconsciously partake of that bias, and which is weird because I've seen how it is. You can have everyone has this crazy experience when they go to sleep, mostly, but they don't really think about it. But if we saw a new kind of monster or alien like in waking life, it would be a big deal. But you see that's like way crazier stuff like, every night. So it's.
I mean, to talk, it's interesting, I'm not particularly meaningful at all, but interesting to compare, the differences between the dream state and the waking state. And, there do seem to be some differences in some sort of gross ways.
Yeah.
In terms of the range of, well, it's hard to even define exactly what the parameters are, what the range of, there's a different degree of consistency of the range of certain characteristics in the waking condition and the dream condition, very, very generally and very grossly speaking.
Yeah.
But then when you go looking into the details again, of course, that falls apart.
Yeah.
You can say that more drastic inconsistency is more liable to occur in the dream.
Yeah.
Houses are liable to start floating into the sky, and when people are liable to start turning into butterflies or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Which is maybe less likely, one may argue, to happen in the waking condition. But on the other hand, if you look at but that's only very grossly and sort of broad strokes of analysis. Because if you look very closely at waking experience, it's entirely unpredictable. And so when you start talking about ranges of degrees of consistency in the face of absolute inconsistency from moment to moment, it gets very slippery again. The whole thing just sort of, you can't, again, it reveals itself that you can't actually pin it down. It's not actually like that. No surprise.
Yeah. Like in waking life, if I look away and look at my hand, I look away and look at my hand, every time it's different. But in a dream, if I look away and look at it, it'll have like more fingers or fewer fingers.
Exactly.
Every time I look back at it.
Right. And so you can argue that absolutely different can be more different than absolutely different.
Yeah.
And so again, and the way that and yeah, that's arguable because it's it's intuitively true. But trying to pin down the way that works is very subtle.
Yeah, but one thing we can say, I think, is that you can tell the difference between the two, but that's very strange how that works. It's like, how can you tell the difference between two thoughts, for instance?
But you can only tell the difference, generally speaking. You can't always tell the difference.
Well, you don't have the faculty.
Because if the way you tell the difference is by the range of consistency of change, let's say, if you want, not that is it, but if that was it, then that you're fine until something really, really weird happens in the waking state.
Yeah.
I mean, suppose the aliens actually land,
Right.
or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Then it's like, whoa, wait a minute, this is a lot weirder than usual, and that can happen. I mean, in the waking state, you were born. That was pretty weird.
Yeah.
You're going to die. That's going to be pretty weird. And so all of a sudden, so weird things, equally weird things can happen in the waking state as a dream state. They just don't seem to as often, and the operative word there is probably again seems.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's correct what I said. The ability to tell the difference between them comes and goes anyway.
Yeah, and ultimately, you can discover that they are the same condition. They may be differentiable in certain ways of the way they seem to more or less generally present, but they are ultimately the same condition. They're ultimately radiant presence, which of course is the important point.
Right.
It occurs to me that to put it simplistically, I'm not sure I'm going to put this very well, but part of the appearance of the dream being more, say, fantastical than the waking state, maybe also because there's sort of a conditioned consensual agreement that is held subliminally somehow, that we're allowed to see more fluctuation in a dream state than we are in a waking state. Because like he was describing, looking over there and then at the hand, well, I might not notice my other hand, and so if that was a dream, it means my left hand was non-existent for one of those looks. You see what I'm saying? And that in itself is fantastical.
Yeah.
It's just that we add so much to it, like, oh, of course I have two hands. Even if I don't see it, I'm assuming it's there.
Sure.
So, and that's sort of a consensual conceptualizing of a reality that isn't at all what we're conceptualizing.
Yeah, exactly. The actuality of experience, moment to moment, is an absolutely inconsistent, non-repeating, all bets are off flow of unexpectedness, of surprise, which is equally true in every state. So that's a true statement, and then so they're getting down to splitting hairs about the degrees to which it's more or less obviously true. It's sort of it's not really to the point. The radiance. The bottom line about the radiance, the bottom line about any experiential condition, is you can't actually find what's actually happening in any instant. So then, to go on about degrees of change to the next instant, where you can't find what's actually happening either, is kind of, is biting off more than you can actually chew. I mean, it's making claims to address something that you're not actually addressing. Because if you don't really know what's happening even in the instant, you can't pin it down, and you can't pin down any instant exactly what's going on. Mm-hmm. So how can you authoritatively then compare that unknowing to some different presentation of unknowing? You can't tell what it is either. So you can't even tell, ultimately whether or not how different they are, because you can't tell what either or any of them actually are at all. I mean, and not in a sense of sophistry or philosophy, but really experientially, you can't get to the bottom of what's happening ever. You can't find what anything is, and so, in the face of that absolute uncertainty, absolute indeterminacy, you can't sort of build any kind of solidity on that as a foundation, because it ain't going to hold anything up. And yet, intuitively, we can make statements like, "Well, yeah, the dream state is differentiable generally from the waking state." But it's all weird. You can't pin that down. You can't back it up, because the waking state is inconceivably, bottomlessly, infinitely weird, and unfindable and undefinable. So, given that as a fact, how can you possibly elaborate on it or build on it? I mean, it's kind of destroy, it completely cancels itself out on the ground floor.
Well, we do see monsters in the waking state. After all, a kid who's looking at in a dim light of his room at a coat rack with things on it and thinks it's a boogeyman is seeing a monster.
Or all these
Because they
scary beings
haven't-
in this row. I mean, it's terrifying.
Another horrible aliens.
These
The
people
room is
are-
full of them.
Anyway, it's break time, so let's go eat some sugar. We'll be back in a little while, online people.
I saw wine too. I forgot wine.
Yeah.
No, I saw it.
Hello.
Manifest itself.
Yeah. Alcohol is very
Wearing all kinds of triangles.
Yeah, I'm triangular today.
Oh, she's even triangular.
yeah,
Look.
she's doing it. Yeah,
She's doing it. She's doing it.
she's in the weird. She's having a weird.
Yeah. She's a triangle too.
I can relate. Yeah, she's.
I can go right there with her. I can follow her. I said, that's nice after all that sun.
Yeah. I can join the party.
Get a glimmer of a sunset. I'm leaving up here.
I have to because they don't get it here. Well, actually, sometimes.
And I like the way the trees get sort of. Talk about monsters.
Yeah, you can stare at the trees and see things after a while. See shapes.
What? They're from, well, they're made in India out of, saris.
Oh, is that what
Like a lot of wedding saris. And I got them from online. Indian. That's cool. Got a whole bunch of them. No, they're more like quilts. They're sort of odd.
That one is like, it's just.
Yeah. And they, I like quilting, but
Been for chai?
just different cultures and different types of quilting. But almost all cultures have some quilting. There was a really great quilting show at the Golden Gate. At the Golden Gate Park Museum Beyond. It was Southern black women, who started in the 20s even without sewing machines. And then they introduced sewing machines. It's a fantastic thing. They were totally freeform. They got even more and more freeform, I think, as they got going. And then there's patchwork. Yeah,
I particularly like that.
Yeah.
Right there with you.
I never know how to do it, but I love to look at it.
I like the bug with
I
your
have
head.
My
Well,
grandmother had
as you were sitting there
a
talking,
rat.
I could
And
see
she
your
would-
head. It reflected on
mostly-
the mirror, and if I was in a more sort of fuzzy state, I would think it was a floating head. How is that not a monster? How is that not weird? If you're just a little spaced out and you isolate one thing,
Yeah.
you actually created a kind of what
Yeah, before you know what's
consensually
going
would be
on.
considered weird.
Yeah.
What's up with your wrist,
That
huh?
can happen sometimes.
Tendinizes.
I suddenly see something. Perspective is weird, and then you just don't know what it is.
Yes, and then after you kind of see what it is, you can't go back to the not seeing it.
Right.
I love that. That's so cool. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, because usually when I do then see what it's supposed to be, I try and see it before that.
Yeah.
And I just can't find it again. It's like it's already become something.
Right.
You can't unmake it.
The other thing I like is when I'm going to a dream and I open my eyes, the dream, or when I wake up at first,
So you're here for another week?
I
Did you get your stuff out of storage
The
Friday?
sensation, yeah, the dream isn't finished.
Yeah, it's not finished, so like, you
All out.
get shadows
It's just
and stuff,
about
and
all
it's
out.
just like
Oh, good.
all kinds of crazy stuff.
Yeah. You're still in it somehow.
Yeah,
You haven't
right.
really stepped over the boundary completely.
Right.
That's good. I like that too. Heard that right. There's a
Especially when you don't care and you don't worry about what it looks like.
Yeah, right.
And you can see like the creature. It's like,
Yeah.
what?
It feels like it's on a deck, like overhanging my house, like.
Oh,
I don't know. I'll lay my head down and immediately just get swept into weird dream.
like those crazy houses.
Dreaming or something, right?
Kind of, but it's much more bizarre because there will be like this weird, like kind of whooshing sensation, like in my head and in my like top of my body. And
Oh, really?
And it's really loud, like there's this really loud sound, and suddenly I'm into this other visualization.
Not like you're passing out into sleep, no?
No, it's different. I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I'll look around and I'll lay my head back down and I'll go whoosh back in. It's like, oh geez, this is really
Really?
crazy.
That is, well, wow. What are you doing?
I'll have my shoes on.
Because I get a sinking feeling sometimes, sort of like, melting into something. And then I realize that I've stepped into another perspective or something. And then it's almost like passing out, but not, you know?
At night.
Well, sitting up, doing something, all of a sudden I go, oh, holy.
We could have had a good time.
And start slipping, you know?
Yeah, it's so weird.
And it doesn't jive with what I was just doing or something. You know? It's like, oh
Space
shit.
Station.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Situation.
Yeah.
I used to get in trouble for that as a
That's
kid.
weird.
I'd be sitting in class and I'd be completely gone.
Yeah, they don't like that.
They don't like that a whole lot.
It's in the way of social control.
Yeah, totally, doesn't it?
Yeah. Daydreaming.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. Yeah, that was one of my favorites. Got me in trouble all the time.
Oh, yeah. I had to lose that second bed.
Yeah.
Well, no. You know, like in college,
I think a lot of us do that, even like when we're just waiting at the cash register.
Yeah, if I did anything,
Right.
this weird other thing that just kind of
Right. Right.
Yeah, what you do is just kick us all the hell out of here. We'll find a bigger
I think
place.
we only think of this waiting stage as being less flexible dream as a consensual filling in that idea because it isn't really. It's kind of weird.
We just feel like we need like some weird stable thing that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
So
not
we don't freak out.
stabilizing fact.
Yeah, right. We added to it.
Ice water, that's a good idea.
The weirdness when it turns into your waking state. That kind of dream stuff. It turns into your waking state. Is there something that like a wall that goes down in the house?
So do you have any more thoughts about that show we saw last night? I didn't like it.
Really?
I didn't like it.
Wait,
I don't know.
question is how does it do it?
Well, it was well,
No, I think it was just more.
So I was at the Gordon clinic
San
yesterday.
Francisco, that theatrical production from the National Theatre of Scotland. Last Watch Regiment in Iraq.
She didn't like
Very Scottish.
Nice light here.
Are they so
Nice light breaking down there.
Yeah, I know.
You have to stop putting a second row behind the couch pan.
no.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
definitely.
That's actually quite good to sit over behind the
Yeah,
couch.
yeah.
Yeah, and then the folding chair.
Yeah,
But it's
put a chair on
Well, how about
Or maybe I'll move the couch a foot.
Well, there's not enough room, and I don't want people back there tomorrow.
Well, I could go back there and just move the couch up just an inch.
Yeah, it's actually quite a bit.
And you just look outside.
You know, you never trust
You
to
look outside.
No, no, facing this way. You know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, you got the
Yeah, I mean,
chair
it's just kind of so.
slide. I might have
No, you have to lift it up.
Yeah, but if you go to negative, she's saying.
We have to move the hassock.
The hygienics.
Do you call this a hassock?
Guys, more than just the general.
It's the back to school.
We're backbenchers.
Right. Maybe you'd like to know.
Well,
The weirdness. Yeah, that's
Some ice water here before we all have to
herb stuff. She said the guy can brings it up a little bit more to I'm not saying that quite logically. There's something that we
Yes, briefly. When you're ready, Peter, ring the bell. Hey.
It really goes against my grain to control anybody at all. I hate it. Ringing a bell. Like, you come back, you come back. You know, hell with it.
Oh, Susan. She said that she could find an
I'm such a confirmed anarchist.
I think it's an apartment. I'll have to check.
Well, then how you send?
I never knew what anarchy was, though. As a political movement.
Anarchy means letting things take their own path.
Delivery of your post.
I don't know if that's what it means to me. It means not imposing control.
No, here. No, I don't want No, but general delivery means you pick it up at the post office. It does not go to your house.
Of course, like with everything, it gets kind of slippery when you want to try to pin it down.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Why? Oh, some of these things you do. It used to be you didn't. Driver's license was all you needed back then. Okay, what are you doing?
Well, I was going to move it over because, I mean,
Oh, I was going to
who's sitting here?
I was trying to figure out where you were.
That's Beth. Beth.
All right.
So, we're back. I declare arbitrarily.
Oh, look at that. Windows open. Nice.
Peter, it's not a question, but I've been thinking, and observing that there's a vast body of thought, belief, and conscious, unconscious stuff that is all predicated on the idea that we have choice, that there is volition. And I can't see. I can see no way to prove that we have volition.
Right.
I can't see any way to disprove it either,
Yeah.
but that whole thing, rests on this, like a huge balloon that rests on this one little point,
Yeah.
that we have choice.
Right.
Any comments?
Sure. Well, the whole issue gets down to suppose you know what volition is or isn't, and of course you can't. So it dissolves itself in its own indefinability. To assume you know what volition is and then to have all sorts of assumptions based on that is obviously flawed. But it's not a question that it doesn't exist, or that it does exist, or you can't find a particular it that existence or non-existence is even relevant to. It's not, again, volition is just not a relevant category. It's not that there's no volition or there is volition. It's not like that, one way or the other. D, none of the above. So, which doesn't, gainsay or cancel out strategies or points of view based on volition. It just means that you can't simplistically assume that volition actually is volition as you think it is. I mean, clearly there's a property that seems as if it was to some degree volitional, and intuitively this is perceivable. But again, of course, you can't actually find what that is, of course. And it's not mutually exclusive from some non-volitional condition, because it's also intuitively obvious that there is that, and infinite relation between them, and yet you can't really, again, you can't pin down what any of that is. So, again, the issue in all of this is devoting much effort and attention to theory is basically essentially pointless. The only attention worth devoting at all, if any, is in pragmatic terms. So if it seems useful to use volition for something, then by all means use volition for something. But don't hold that any of that is actually anything. It's just a matter of making use of a tool at hand, or fabricating your tools if it seems useful for a particular task that seems doable.
Well, I wasn't trying to actually solve the problem theoretically or get a real hold on it, but I was just trying. I find that I can't identify. I can't catch volition.
Exactly.
And I can't really. Theoretically speaking, I know that I can never go back and do the same thing twice and then see what I would have done. There's no way to prove it like that. All you can do is look at when you think you are making a choice and see what's actually happening.
Yeah.
And that's
yeah. So you can use apparent volitionality as a vehicle for noticing. I look at when you're making a choice, look at what's actually happening. Mm-hmm. Or if it seems expedient to choose to do something for some reason, you're free to do that without worrying too much about what it is you're doing, if anything. I mean, like in terms of, to me, the only real pragmatism is the yoga. And if you can seem to choose to do the yoga, then that's pragmatically useful, if it seems to be pragmatically useful. Without, which begs the question of whether or not you can choose to do it, and whether or not there's an actual yoga. But that's irrelevant, because again, you're not concerned with theory at that point, you're concerned with practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're doing it when you're looking at volition itself.
Yeah, same thing, yeah, of course. Yeah.
What a great idea. The back skulls.
Back picture.
Cheap seat.
We can build a lock too. That's right. Yeah.
Or little hanging hammocks.
Yeah. Interesting question, Peter. Noticing is revealing each textural dimension in a sensory bandwidth. The dimension of this to be essentially made from a single, unpindownable non-substance. Could you talk about this?
Yeah, except it's not single. I mean, it seems to be single in terms of its interface point or access point or something, but in noticing it's discovered to be infinite and infinitely dimensional. So whatever your experiential starting point for noticing per se, like it might be some detail of your field of vision or whatever, in noticing it is quickly or perhaps immediately revealed to be absolutely open dimensional, to be simultaneously, inconceivably, mutually exclusive and non-consistent modes of presentation simultaneously. And then you discover that anything, any aspect of the experiential field, let's say, is actually infinite and unfindable and rich with infinite qualities and potencies and what have you, textures. That's the condition of non-noticing consists of a very heavy censorship of all of the intrinsic multidimensionality down to a relatively to a virtual or virtually held relatively limited condition or single condition or somehow some degree of coherence. In actuality, there's no coherence. Experience is completely incoherent. And when you look at any portion of it whatsoever, you discover that. And in that incoherence, I mean, you can call it incoherent, you can call it multidimensional, you can call it indeterminate, all these kinds of things. But the point is, it doesn't resolve down into any consistency whatsoever, while being infinitely pregnant with implications. And since this is always the case within any and all experience, it's very easy to notice that at any time, if you happen to do it. It's kind of another way to look at belief. We were talking about belief earlier. And belief is ultimately the belief in coherence. And actuality is actually incoherent. And when you discover that fact, then coherence is revealed as a myth, as a partialization.
Coherence, the belief in coherence, you talked about like the analogy of a stabilizer on a camera or something.
I see, that's nice. Yeah.
It happens. Like so many things, so it kind of happens subconsciously or automatically.
Yeah.
Like I can go look at my experience right now. It's all these flashes of stuff, and my awareness is darting all over the place, and it's this big maelstrom of who knows what. And then at the same time, there's that stabilizing factor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it's a city. It's an inherent potency of the inherent intelligence that it can and does do that. But its doing it doesn't actually create any coherence, even though it enables itself to relate to the patterns as if they were coherent.
Yeah.
But there's no actual coherence being created.
Right.
And that's the difference between being with coherence and belief in coherence as the objective condition. To believe anything, there has to be sufficient coherence in the thing that you think you're believing for it to be something specific enough to believe in. I mean, I put that more sloppily sometimes by saying that anything that seems to be something is a symptom of belief, because the actual condition is not coherent enough to be a particular something.
Yeah. There's some interplay between investigation and dismantling of beliefs, where by investigating, you can see, one can potentially see that empirically that what they thought to be true isn't true.
Yeah, it's relatively, even if you don't discover the fact of absolute inconsistency or the fact of absolute indeterminacy, it's very easy to discover that there is less coherence than you suppose in the experiential actuality of anything.
Yeah.
So in other words, even if you don't go the distance and get but there's no coherence,
Right.
which is the actual condition. You don't need to go that far. Just the fact that there's not as much coherence as you thought for you to maintain that any condition is what you're holding it to be undermines that particular holding.
Yeah.
Or at least, if it's not totally canceling it, at least makes it severely called into question.
Well, I mean, it immediately creates a bunch of stuff to sort of integrate or play with because it keeps whatever that investigation reveals keeps presenting in more and different.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, once you open Pandora's box, it's hard to get the demons back. It's hard to get the chaos back inside. It's a good book title, Pandora's Box. Open at your peril.
Yeah.
It's old. This thread runs through philosophy for ages. The conflict or the conundrum of cosmos versus chaos. Order versus disorder. And of course, usually people are coming down very heavy-handedly on the side of order as being the good guy or the preferred condition.
Yeah.
But of course, that's all ass backwards. I mean, this essentially resonates with the right-hand path and the left-hand path. The same thing. Or the old, in the older mythologies, the mythologies that are solar-centric and the mythologies that are lunar-centric, the mythologies that celebrate a god and the mythologies that celebrate a goddess. I mean, it's all the same, the same resonance in all of these different traditions that just goes back historically forever.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of sheds new light on the old phrase, "The devil's in the details."
Yeah.
One thing about the retreat was that I found it very hard to kind of understand really a word of what was going on most of the time. So I guess that might have been a positive thing.
Of course, because of course it's not about the words. The words are Trojan horses. the point of the words is to destroy the words. So
It just seems like my brain sort of shut down in a functional way, apparently functional way at the moment, in terms of tracking with any sort of intellectual conversation.
Oh, great! Well, that's wonderful. That's the point of the thing.
It can feel a little disorienting.
Well, that's the point of the thing
That's the
too.
idea.
Yeah.
That's one.
Orientation is the challenge.
That's for sure.
Good.
Going back to the notion of problems, there's, when we were talking about that earlier, I was thinking about, there's some way of relating to, like, say, coming to satsang as if there's something to get there, or or there's something, some kind of realization that somebody can have, or and that there's an implication in that there's a problem with the current way things are. So it's paradox. I mean, then there's at the same time coming to satsang, which who knows why that's happening. And I mean, it's fun and interesting and all these other things that maybe don't have more to do with compulsion or interest than some like specific notion of getting something.
But this whole notion of problems is really is supremely valuable in this yoga, because the problems are a searchlight, like a spotlight directed exactly on your cutting edge of what needs attention. So anything that seems to be an issue whatsoever, the fact that seems to be an issue is to draw your attention to check out what's going on there. So I mean, it's literally your cutting edge. And then, of course, the antidote or the process is to apply noticing to that issue, or that locus that's illuminated by this seeming to be something. And then it will, of course, dissolve until, as it seems to be, the spotlight of problematical shines on something else, and then you hit that. I mean, that's very specifically the practice of yoga radiant presence. Is, anything that seems to be a problem means that a solution needs to be applied.
Right. Makes sense.
Until there's no more problems.
Well, there's the thing that, and we've talked about this too, but with that refocusing of the spotlight, it always seems like the looming problem is as big as big, potentially. And even if it's like, if you have some reason to remember, your impressions from the past, that maybe that you were up against much bigger hang-ups and that were like way more limiting or way more interfering with your enjoyment, but they just kind of get forgotten or something.
Yeah, because there's no objective scale. Any problem is big, is huge. Is the size of the universe, is the size of you. Because it is, it defines a worldview. A problem is a subliminal holding that defines a worldview, and of course a worldview includes everything. And then you pop the problem, pops the worldview, the whole universe collapses until a new universe crystallizes around a new seeming problem.
So there's potentially endless problems, but at some
Well,
point you see that
potentially,
there's
except
no
yeah, because
problems
the
don't exist.
trick is, the secret is, of course, that they aren't serial. You're not actually getting anywhere when you
Yeah.
pop these problems.
You're
It's not like
seeing-
you're actually making any progress.
Right.
But every time you do that, arguably, you're being exposed to the subtle fact that, wait a minute,
Yeah.
let me make a big leap here.
Yeah.
You know, if this applies to any problem, it applies to every problem. So every problem is solved by this, and so you may as well consider it solved a priori,
Right.
which means there's no problems, without having to go through the rigmarole.
Yeah.
And then you're free to do noticing once in a while just to verify. It's like, yep, no problems here, nothing here, nothing here, but that's infinite radiance.
A lot of times when I think about problems, and I start following that track, I come to the fact that the problem is I'm a person and I'm going to die. I mean, that seems to be the
Yeah.
main problem.
Sure. Well, that's a good one. If that seems to be a problem, then check it out.
Yeah. But I mean, all problems, when you said that, all problems, small or large, they're all sort of the same, the same.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Death in a flat tire.
Yeah. The problem is that anything seems to be the case. And if
Yeah.
anything seems to be the case, then by implication everything seems to be the case.
Right.
And then what do you do about all that?
Yeah.
And yeah, you're a person, you're going to die, you're in your life, you got flat tires, you got to make money, you got to pay... Yeah. So you get all this endless shopping list of shit. And it all bootstraps up on any portion of it. As soon as any portion of it is actual, then it's all actual because it all sort of fits into the same gestalt. It all applies itself by the instantaneous generation of a worldview.
But then you die, and then none of it matters anymore.
Until it does. Well, until it does. Life or death is not the issue. I mean, you'd think if that was the case, you'd think going to sleep would do it. Right.
No, because you wake up and there are still bills.
Yeah, but when you die, you die and you wake up and there's still, life forms to eat. I mean, God knows
That's
what.
true, yeah. You can't.
So, the solution is to see that there is no life, there is no death, there are no bills, there's just radiance. And then the bills and the life and the death are all taking care of themselves.
When a bill comes in, I'm like, oh, great.
You pay it or you don't. And then more shit happens, and that does itself too, and the whole thing just snowballs on and on through infinity forever, like it is, and nothing's ever resolved. Right? Not like you ever cross a finish line or something.
Yeah. You just pay one bill, there's another one comes in.
Yeah, or you don't pay it, another one comes in.
There is no bill.
And shit happens, and then more shit happens. But it's all radiance. Solving a problem does not solve the problem of problems. The only thing that solves the problem of problems is seeing that there are no problems. And that solves the problem of problems generically across the board for all time. And fortunately, it happens to be the case. So it's doable.
I suppose, in that respect, Peter, like the questions that I have around the solving of the problem are, can you decide to solve the problem? Does it just happen? As long as there are questions around how the problem is to be solved, obviously the problem hasn't been solved.
Yeah, because the questions are themselves problems.
Right.
Yeah.
And I suppose you don't know that until you know it.
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, of course.
So,
But it's knowable at any time just by noticing. If you look at any apparent condition whatsoever, it's really quite easy to see that it transcends what you're holding it to be. Even if you can't say what that transcendence is, I mean, which of course you won't be able to, but nonetheless it becomes obvious that there's more going on, which means that your version of things isn't accurate, which means that there's no particular point getting all twisted up about it, because it's you're missing at least a lot, if not all of it.
right. So that is in fact the answer.
Yeah, of
to the
course.
question.
Yeah.
So the thinking there is an answer is the problem.
Yeah, if there's a question and answer, a problem and a solution, you're screwed.
Yeah.
But when you discover that the question or the problem is itself not actually that,
Yeah.
and not actually anything findable,
Yeah.
you jump off a cliff. And
So just bypassing everything.
yeah, exactly,
None of
bypass
the
everything.
above.
Yeah.
Yeah.
None of the above. Slip out the back, Jack. You don't need to win the game. You just throw down your pieces in a huff and storm out.
Yeah, I used to do that to my brother playing tennis when we were kids. If I was losing, I would just
Yeah, exactly.
pull over to the
Yeah,
green.
losing's not a problem.
That's what girls do.
Just fuck off.
Yeah, right.
I remember you saying to someone at the retreat that non-access is the access, so that way,
Sure.
like losing is totally an epic win.
Yeah, sure.
And it's all rolled in there.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the greatest.
Yeah, anything whatsoever is a contact point and a total revelation of radiance. So not getting it, or being stuck in failure, or any condition whatsoever, even if you're holding it to be horrible and negative and stuck, is in actuality an immediate invitation for total revelation of radiance, because there's nothing else there, absolutely nothing else there. So it's always your interface point. If you click anywhere on the screen,
You did it.
you did it. Win the game.
Or if you don't click anything in time and the timer just expires, you win.
You
the
still
game.
win.
Well, there's no losing. But
You walk away from the computer, you win.
Idiots for 100, Alex.
you're not watching enough daytime TV.
I guess
These
not.
days it's nighttime, I guess.
Peter, there's a couple of questions here about just basically, so what's happening with things like clairvoyance or other psychic phenomena?
Well, there's nothing but psychic phenomena. Psychic phenomena are just discovering meaning, discovering intelligence in form, and which is always a nonlinear occurrence, and all form is a vehicle and an expression of intelligence. So any and everything can show up as meaningful intelligence. So in other words, the field of experience consists of an infinite presentation of call them patterns, and every one of those patterns conveys information. Every one of those patterns is like an encyclopedia. So you might have some little vibe that you know, and you can look into that vibe and see something that someone's thinking about, or see that the phone's about to ring, or see what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, you know, and or not, right? And so it's not a special case. It's just a particular instance of you know, tuning into the inherent intelligence, and the inherent intelligence tunes into itself randomly. So it'll appear as coherence, and all of a sudden there's some content, and then it'll lapse into incoherence, and it's all just fuzz. Which, of course, it mostly is most of the time. It's kind of like, free associating our clouds. Most of the time they're just clouds, but every now and then they're, wow, that looks just like a lion. So it's sort of, it comes together in terms of pattern. And,
So clairvoyant is just sort of picking out a certain pattern.
Sure. It's no different than reading an astrological chart,
right,
or reading a palm, or anything like that. It's being with an energy pattern, an experiential energy pattern that's appearing in your field of experience, and having the inherent intelligence show up with sufficient coherence to convey meaningfulness.
Sort of a correlated another question. People have been chatting back and forth.
Sure, of course.
Yeah. But the question is, some psychics say they can predict the future.
Sure.
And the question is, well, how could that possibly be if it's just now and everything is just appearing now?
Nothing is just anything. You can't say what's happening sufficiently. It can be powerful to say, oh, there's only the present moment, there's no past and no future, and that's a nice strategic position that undermines some sense that there is a past and a future, but it's not true. It's just using a notion to eradicate a false notion, but the notion that you're using is in itself true. There's no way that things are. It's not that there's no past and no future. There's no past and there's no future, but don't let that get in the way of there being a past and a future. Things are entirely unpredictable, but don't let that get in the way of making predictions. There's no linearity. There's not enough coherence for any condition to mutually exclude any other condition. If it happens, it happens. People can't fly unless they do. You can't tell the future unless you do. You can't send a man to the moon unless you do. And there's absolutely no basis for knowing or saying or declaring what's possible or impossible. Absolutely none. Which certainly includes psychic phenomena. Psychic phenomena are frequently held to be exceptional qualities of event or modes of functioning, because they seemingly transcend the materialist paradigm of the laws of physics and worldviews and all these things, where things are limited to their physical forms and so on and so forth, and there's no explanation for the way these things happen. But it's an absurdity to suppose that worldview of materialism is in any way accurate or true.
Right. So it doesn't really make a difference whether you're a psychic or not.
Yeah, there's nothing but patterns on every level, on every dimension of, say, density of experience. And all patterns convey intelligence. All patterns are nothing but intelligence. So there's no surprise that meaningfulness can be found anywhere.
I saw a great cake he had the other day that had Big Bird on the moon. When man was landing on the moon, he had Big Bird there as well with a little kid. It was kind of cute.
Yeah.
Question about noticing.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhat on the subject, that's sort of spinning off from that subject. Is it possible to be holding something to be a certain way, very firmly holding it to be a certain way, and be noticing it at the same time?
Yes. But the noticing will tend to be contradictory of the holding, which of course is not a problem, because we're quite used to being completely inconsistent and incoherent, because we are all the time. But it can tend to undermine the holding, but it doesn't necessarily have to, and they can certainly coexist. They do coexist always, because everyone has experience. Everyone experiences as much coherence as they do, and they're simultaneously experiencing an inconceivable degree of incoherence. This is a normal human condition.
So there's no true optical illusion. I mean, there's not a light like the faces and
Right.
the vases.
Right.
You're really the snake in the rope, the typical paradigm.
Right.
It's one or the other.
No, there's no mutual exclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Because and this is an artifact of the conscious mind in the context of the unconscious mind.
Mm-hmm.
From the, and again, there's no such thing, of course, in either case. But from the point of view of the conscious mind, things are a certain way. From the point of view of the unconscious mind, things are not a certain way. Things are the way, which is open and infinite, and the two coexist. The conscious mind cannot assimilate or understand the unconscious mind, but the unconscious mind can assimilate and understand the conscious mind. And of course, experientially, everyone is always in both minds. Although, if a person is identifying more heavily with their conscious mind, they don't know they're in their unconscious mind because they can't recognize it from a conscious perspective. But they are actually there. The gap, when the experiential division gets a little more transparent or non-existent, then it becomes a non-issue, and you get quite used to the fact that you are always, in your experience as being a certain way, even at the same time as you are in your experience as being many other ways than the way that you're being in it. And the fact that that's gibberish and makes no sense and is inconsistent is not a problem, because it's a fact. It doesn't need to be logical. It's experiential truth. And in that context, noticing and not noticing will always coexist. Because there will always be some degree of holding things to be a certain way. And in actual fact, there's always some degree of seeing that they're more than that. So noticing is really a kind of a trick of flirting with the boundary between conscious and unconscious modes. But both modes are always in full operation. I mean, that's part of what I mean when I say humans are crazy. Because we're not consistent. We're not one thing or another thing. We're all over the place. We're who we are. We're who our personalities are. We're the limited people that we are. And at the same time, we're unlimited and inconceivable and vastly more than that. And it's not. There's no tension whatsoever between those two incompatible conditions. It makes no sense, but there you go.
Seems like it's only crazy to think that you're only part of that.
Well, ultimately, yeah. It's crazy to think you're sane. Anybody thinks they're sane, thinking you're sane is a sign of a crazy person. Knowing you're crazy is a sign of a sane person. And crazy is in this context, is a synonym for knowing that you are inconsistent and operate in many different, inconsistent modes simultaneously. In other words, knowing you're incoherent, which of course is a fact. And denying you're incoherent, and insisting and pretending you're coherent, is a sign of a loony. These are technical terms.
Technical.
But there's nothing wrong with loony.
No, of course not.
A loony in a pickle.
Good news for this group.
Yes.
That's actually one of the reasons that I use this notion more and other, because noticing is essentially discovering more and other in any experience, and more and other is not the opposite of its starting point, it is more and other than its starting point. So the starting point kind of comes along with there is the context within which more and other presents itself, which is kind of again the two modes of having the specific and the open-ended coexisting. Well, it's quitting time. So good night, online people.